Welcome to School of PE podcast. I'm your host, Chris Miller, and I'm so glad that you could join me this week. We are going to discuss topics about FE, PE, and SC, and we're also going to answer questions that will help students prepare for their exams. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to another exciting episode of the SOPE's podcast. Again, my name is Chris Miller, and today I got a returning guest with me here, Mr. James Lindsey. Had the pleasure of meeting and talked to him a few episodes ago, where he was here talking about some transmission hardware and assemblies. But he's back today to talk about the FE and PE exams, share some of his strategies, plus his experiences on his journey from FE to PE. So please, let's welcome back Mr. James Lindsey. James, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. Thank you for having me again. Definitely glad to be back.
Sounds good. A lot has changed, at least in the sports realm, for the two of us since the last time we spoke.
Yeah, a lot has transpired.
Some teams moving up, some teams are moving down. But it's an exciting race till the end there.
Right.
We kind of briefly touched on some, of your experiences throughout the FE and the PE exam. But as it gets closer to October and the big boy exam is coming up here at the end of October, I thought it'd be a great opportunity for us to kind of chat and for you to share your experiences a little bit more in detail to kind of help those that have maybe gone through the journey and are going again, or maybe it's their first time through the journey. So, it'd be great if you could kind of share that with us here today. Let's travel back in time a little bit and we'll talk about the FE exam. So, can you talk about your experiences with the FE exam?
I had some ups and downs with the FE exam. So for me, and I know a lot of people may or may not discuss this, but for me, it took me a couple tries to get there. And so, excuse me, I did the normal, the practice problems, the practice test out the book, trying to figure out what worked for me. But it wasn't really the straightforward route. So my experience is really interesting, but it actually motivated me to keep going. And I think actually gave me a chance to go even deeper with the knowledge that I was able to get during those times.
All right, great. So outside of doing practice problems and, maybe some practice tests, what other exam preparation did you do?
I did a lot of different things. I did flashcards. I actually found a website. I can't remember the name of it at the moment, but just something that had like some FE terms for the FE civil exam. I used friends and family to help me review the flashcards that I made, coworkers, and then definitely trying to apply whatever I was going over to real life. And I think that's one of the big things was sometimes it's hard to picture things. And I was able to talk to different coworkers or different colleagues and ask them different questions about certain problems and how they would apply to the real world. And I would say that's more so for the afternoon, or well, I guess there's not really an afternoon portion, but the second version, so the second half of the FE exam than the first portion. More so with, I guess, the geotech, the water resources and things of that nature, and structural as well.
Very good. Yeah, I agree with you in the sense that if you can, memorizing things is great, but like when it comes to the test and also let's say something's not going the way you had planned, you start to stress and that memorization kind of goes out the window.
Right.
But, if you actually can see how things apply in the real world, like you mentioned, it makes it a lot easier because you have understanding the concept and you can apply it. And so therefore you're not relying so much on memorization. So great point for that. So, if you were to look back again, could you tell us what the most difficult part of the FE exam is and maybe what the easiest part was for you?
That's actually an interesting question. If I'm being frank, studying itself is probably the hardest part, or working up the strength to keep up the, staying consistent and things like that. But one of the times that I took to PE, I did the School of PE classes, and so when you do, I had the on-demand version, not the live. So one of the challenges is mentally telling yourself, okay, I'm going to do this video and then I'm going to do these practice problems or that go along with it, or things of that nature. And then pausing the video, restarting, fast forward. And that was difficult to me because it was like, okay, this video says that is, an hour and a half or 2 hours. Why is it taking me, 3 hours to get through it? And at that time, I wasn't thinking about, okay, this is recorded, and I'm sure that there's parts that might have been cut out of it, or even like when you do a class live, you have the chance to kind of work the problem yourself, and you still have to get to go through things afterwards, and even ask the teacher questions on the side. So
it makes sense. So, a lot of times when, I talk to the students and they're like, how do you approach the on-demand versus the live online, in the sense that, as you mentioned, during the live online classes or even an on-site class, the instructor will give you some time to work on problems before they go over the solutions. So right. What I do is, and what you did is, I tell people, if an instructor says, hey, let's take the next 15 minutes to work on these problems, pause the recording, work on those problems. That way you're not going straight to the solution. Right. You're giving yourself an opportunity to work through the problems before you see how the instructor solves it. So no, that's some great advice. So, when people are preparing for an exam, they try all kinds of things, right? They throw the kitchen sink at it, and sometimes it's a bunch of trial and error, what works, what doesn't work. So in preparing, whether it was for the FE or the PE exam, what are some of the things that worked, and what were some of the things that didn't work?
So what the biggest thing, and this isn't, I guess, necessarily geared towards studying itself, was creating a schedule. So for me, basically kind of estimating, because the time that I did pass the PE, it has switched, FE, it has switched over to the computer-based test by this time. So once I knew that, I knew that I needed to figure out, okay, what time do you plan on taking this test? Because when you schedule your exam, there's certain days I believe that you can and can't take it, or at least at that time, that's how it worked. So I figured out kind of about what time I wanted to take the exam, like when during the year, and I got an Excel spreadsheet. I used my diagnostic, my results from my diagnostics, and I basically took that and I said, okay, these are the exams that I need to work on, or these are the portions of the exam I need to work on the most. This is what I need to work on kind of medium, and this is what I need to work on the least. So from there, I was able to schedule basically like what weeks I was going to go over what subjects, and then break it down from there and say what days I was going to go over certain things. Once I did that, then it was just about chugging through and making sure I could get through. But then the second part to that is being able to make sure that you don't get down on yourself about maybe missing a day or something. So let's say, for instance, if I was supposed to do math and hydrology and hydraulics in one day, if I missed maybe the hydraulics part because I took longer on the math part to understand the problem, I knew that there was nothing wrong with that. Now, sometimes I would beat myself up, but looking back, you realize that taking that extra time, maybe on a subject that you needed that help, it doesn't hurt you in the long run. And then you can, and then using the weekends as catch up was really important as well. Another thing is being able to not stress too much and not and allow myself to have fun at the same time.
Sure, no, great advice. Time management is very important, not only during the preparation of your study, but also during the exam itself. So planning a schedule makes a lot of sense. Because what happens is, let's say, you decide in January that you want to take your FE in May.
Right.
That's a long time, right? Everyone thinks, oh man, that's an eternity. Well, what happens is time goes by rather quickly. Next thing you're like, holy cow, it's April 15th. I got less than 30 days to go. I better get going. But, if you have created a study schedule, like you mentioned, or a calendar, it allows you to kind of plot out your course and allow for some of those hiccups along the road. But, I also agree with you in the sense that if you are taking longer on a particular subject and you're not sticking entirely to the plan because you're still learning some of the, previous material, it's okay. But, on the flip side, you had to kind of kick yourself in gear as well, because, time will eventually run out. But being able to adapt is important. And also, moving on from any obstacles is also important.
Yeah, I'd say, oh, sorry.
No, please.
One thing I forgot to mention was I knew that I knew that from taking the exam previous times. I knew that math was the first subject on the exam, and I knew that. So I'll just go ahead and say it. It took me 4 times to pass the exam. So I failed it 3 times, and then on the 4th time I passed it. And so to a lot of people, that's a lot, and they're like, oh, how did you even, why did you even keep going? Or like, and there were times when I did get down about that, but I knew that if I started off right on the math portion of the exam, then I knew that would build up my confidence, and I could move on to the other subjects, which I may have been stronger in, or the subjects I was looking forward to, and I could knock them out as long as I wasn't thinking in the back of my head, okay, dang, I messed up on this problem. I've got to go back. And then, I knew something. I knew I could, get past the math part, and then I'd be good. So that was something that I did. I would say another thing is, don't get bogged down on those problems that they're just really long and they're not going to be on the exam. You've got to keep in mind that, what is it, 4 minutes, 4 minutes on the morning portion, I want to say, and 6 minutes on the afternoon. I might be mixing that up, or mixing it up with the PE, but you've got to keep in mind that the problems can only be but so long. And there are test booklets out there, preparation booklets, that have problems that are way out of scope, or that, it's making you better in math, but is that really what's going to be on the exam? So you got to think about, what is my scope of work, for lack of a better term or better phrase, like what is actually going to be there. And it's good to get insight on that as well. As one thing I did, there were some problems that I got stumped on. I was like, how am I supposed to get through this in 4 or 5 minutes? And I let coworkers look at it, and they've said, I don't think this is going to be on there. So
that's good advice.
Yeah.
Essentially it is a race against the clock, and you don't want to spend a whole lot of time on one particular problem, especially in your preparation. It's great to study problems that might be a little more difficult that you might encounter on the exam, but you might be doing yourself a little bit more harm than you are good.
Right.
So some great advice there. So, as we talk about the FE and the PE, I'll ask you about resources here in a minute. So we'll talk about the FE first, because the resources that you can utilize are a little bit, they're different.
Right.
So, you mentioned earlier that when you were studying for the FE that you did flashcards, you did practice tests, things like that. So what would you say are some of the most crucial resources that you utilized in your preparation for the FE?
Most crucial resources? I would say the practice test were the most crucial, but also creating an environment for myself that is similar to day of the exam, and that's probably, I don't know if you would consider it an advantage that I had taken it, and I realized, okay, you don't get certain things, like when it switched from paper to computer based. It went from you having scratch paper or a booklet to work in to you don't have any paper at all. So you've just got I guess I don't really know what to call it, but you get a marker, like a Sharpie, and you get a tablet, an erasable tablet to write on. And when I took it computer based, the first time, I was really thrown off by that. So I was like, oh, what am I going to use? And so I was writing too big. It was erasing. I feel like the eraser wasn't working that well. I wasn't fully prepared, from the standpoint. It's almost like the exam had home field advantage over me. So when I took it the next time, when I passed, I had home field advantage over the exam, because I knew that there was going to be a little eraser and a marker, and that was it. So when I prepared for the exam, that's exactly how I did it. I took it on an exam. Sorry, I took it on a computer. Took the exam on a computer, and I practiced with the Sharpie and a dry erase marker / board type thing. And I think that really helped me. I think it's also important to realize that when you are taking these practice exams, that each one is going to be different, no matter where you get it from, and there's different people have different reasons why they ask certain questions. So keep that in mind, and know that it's actually helping you, because one thing that kind of threw me off was when I didn't do as good as I wanted on the practice exam. I was kind of bummed when I was like, man, what am I going to do? My exam is 2-3 weeks from now. So.
No, agree. Great sports analogy you used as well. You want to make it to where you have the home field advantage per se over the exam.
Right.
And I think the best way to do it is like preparing, like what you did. You practice with a Sharpie, a dry erase board, marker to kind of simulate that atmosphere that you're going to encounter during the exam. Because I think sometimes that's a huge obstacle for a lot of people, right? It's an unknown. How are you going to feel? What are the expectations you're going to have during the exam? So if you can kind of train yourself, I think you definitely give yourself a home field advantage, which is great. So earlier in the podcast, you shared some, personal information about, not having to take the exam multiple times before you pass the FE exam, which I think happens to a lot of people. But I think one thing that definitely separates you from probably a lot of people is the fact that you didn't put your head down and you didn't just give up. So what kept you going? What kept you driving to the point to where you took it again and then you took it again until you passed?
Well, for me, I knew that I knew that I had a goal that I wanted to reach. And so the biggest thing was keeping that in mind, and really just saying, okay, can you live with yourself if you don't at least accomplish this goal? And it was very mental, telling myself each day, okay, don't count yourself out. You're just as worthy as anybody else. You got to put in the work. There's many people that have struggles and either don't talk about it or B, don't keep going. So it was good every day, just realizing that I was working towards, something that I wanted. And it's about putting it in perspective.
All right. Very good. Very good. So, people try all sorts of study tactics. They maybe sleep with the book under their pillow, hoping the knowledge will transfer, all kinds of weird things, strange things, anything it takes to maybe get an edge or to help prepare for the exam. So what are some of the tactics that maybe you've heard about or maybe that you tried that they sounded so good, but they had to be it couldn't be real? I guess what I'm trying to say is what sounded too good to be true?
For the FE, I don't know of anything that's too good to be true necessarily. For the PE, I have maybe one or two, but the FE, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, really. I will say that for me, there were some times when I would fall asleep listening to a recording or something of that nature. And I've always had some sort of thought process towards that because when I was in high school, sometime I was in drama class and the teacher was like, yeah, you should, recite your monologue before going to sleep. And, because it'll be on your mind and you might dream about it. And that way you become more familiar with it. So I did stuff like that. Now, I'm not saying that always works or anything, but if you think about it subconsciously, your mind is taking in some information.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, I think the same thing too. I remember when I was in, my lower education too, is like memorizing something for a play. I remember I was a snowman for a Christmas play, and I was nervous. They're like, no, recite your lines before you go to sleep, and it's going to stay in there. I was like, there's no way that's true. But hey, I was a pretty good snowman. So, appreciate you sharing that. So as you look back on the types of questions that you took on the FE, anything that you took from the FE is something that you use in your day-to-day activities? Any of that information that you had to know for the exam still, I guess, transgressed into your everyday activities?
Yes. From the FE, I would definitely say, so pretty much everything on the afternoon portion, the hydrology, or hydrology / water resources, the mechanics of materials, static stuff. Those are all things that I would say I subconsciously use in my everyday. Geotechnical, definitely. And actually, let me correct myself. Maybe not every day, but it's definitely stuff that I use because in my field, you have different portions of projects that you do. So you're not going to have your geotechnical portion at the beginning of the project, really. At least the part that I'm involved in is going to come more towards the middle of the project because you've got to start up top. You have to know which which type of conductors and things of that you're using. Once you know that, then you know what types of loads you're pulling off on the structure, which just then translates down to the base, which is going to be, your anchor bolts, base plate, and stuff like that. So just talking in general about properties and properties of different structures and things like that's the mechanics of materials, the statics, the dynamic side of things as well. And I would say I use that every day. Water resources I may not use as much, just because I'm not I'm not in hydrology or anything of that nature.
Okay.
But if you gave me something, I would know what's going on with it for the most part.
Very good, very good. So you shared a lot of great information with the audience about the FE exam.
Mm-hmm.
As we're getting closer to October, PE is right around the corner. So let's kind of move our focus towards the PE exam.
Okay.
Really quick before we get too deep in, the biggest change is coming that this October is the last paper and pencil for this PE civil exam. So there'll be a transition to CBT effective in January. So we'll kind of talk about that here. But, since you've taken both exams, what ways did your preparation differ between preparing for the FE and preparing for the PE?
Right. So once I passed the FE, I went straight into taking when I passed the FE, I went straight into taking the PE. I lost my train of thought. And my study habits were kind of the same. I was using a practice exam. What I first tried to do was take a practice exam and then kind of see where I was and go from there. And I don't know that necessarily worked that much. It may have given me a way to see kind of what I might have been strong in, but I think it was a little unfair. I ended up tweaking the way that I was studying. I ended up tweaking it a little bit differently. So I still did flashcards for the PE. I still use friends and family to help me with those flashcards or different things like that. But in terms of what was different, I still made a schedule. I did not stick to it as much, and that's only because the PE in a certain sense is a little bit broader depending on what your depth portion is. So you've got to be careful not to get hung up on little things, and it's really hard to make a schedule for the PE because the topics, like I said, on the afternoon, they don't relate as much. At least for me, they didn't. So I had like a rough schedule, but not as detailed as the one for the FE.
Oh, very good, very good. So, looking again at the FE and PE exam, did you notice any differences in content between the two exams? You were mentioning one's broader than the other. Maybe one didn't get as deep as the other. Mm-hmm. Talk about some of those differences.
Yeah. So, and this also is going to vary depending on which exam you take, and if you're doing civil, mechanical, electrical, you've got different exams, but then even inside of those, you've got different breakdowns as well. So it kind of just depends. But to me, I've always looked at it as the PE. When you finish the FE, is like a to be continued sign that pops up at the end, and then the PE starts off at that to be continued, and you get all the ending scenes, and everything is coming back. So you're kind of starting off where you left off from the FE, and then once you go into the PE, you're kind of you're getting into more depth. I guess is why it's called the depth of it. And the biggest difference I would say is that you're using a lot more code and things of that nature. So on the morning portion of the PE, you might have to use the code a little bit, but most times you're going to need to need to use the code for the afternoon. And so it's not always about the calculations or the fastest way you can do something. A lot of times it's about being able to find the right resource. That's the biggest part of it.
It makes sense. And I probably mentioned this on a previous podcast too. One of the great things about the PE exam being open book is you can take in 1 million references. But with that comes its own, I guess, hiccups in the sense that it's still a timed exam. So if you're taking in 100 books, you better make sure you know those books well, in the sense that you're tabbing them. Make sure you know your references, just like, even with the FE,
Right.
the book exam, all you have access to is the FE, the NCS's reference handbook. You
Mm-hmm.
still want to become very familiar with that book. That way you're not spending a lot of time during the exam flipping through the book. So I think you're right. Sometimes, knowing your resources is or your references is essential to your success on the exam.
Right.
Everyone has expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it be, the first time you're meeting your in-laws, or maybe you're the
Right.
first time you're going on a date, you got these expectations. So I'm sure that you had expectations of what the PE exam was going to be like. So thinking back again, comparing to your actual experience to what your expectations were, how would you describe that?
I would say the PE ended up, well, it was longer. It was longer in the sense that, because when I finished the FE, the FE was maybe 5 or 6 hours, whereas it used to be 8. So now I was like, okay, I've got to find a way to truck through 8 hours of an exam. That was one of the big things. But in terms of what was on there, it probably was some code stuff on there that I wasn't necessarily expecting. But again, and being transparent, my struggles that I had with the PE also, I didn't pass it on the first try. But I think that, being able to be able to realize what I needed to focus on was what helped me in the end.
Very good, very good. Perseverance is key, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have so as we mentioned earlier, the PE is getting ready to transition to CBT. So do you have a preference in exam format? Are you more leaning towards paper and pencil or computer-based? What are your thoughts on the two?
So I would say I prefer paper and pencil, just because that's, I guess, kind of what I'm used to. And then also, even for me, even at work, sometimes it feels like I'm like touching the problem or whatever, or I'm more hands-on when I'm able to do paper and pencil. You can draw stuff on a computer. I'm not fully sure how all this is going to work. But I did hear that it's not open book anymore. Is that correct?
It will be after this. Yes, after this October, it'll be a closed book.
It'll be closed book. So I'm interested to know how that will work and how that's going to be regulated, because there's sometimes, there were a couple of references that I took for the PE that I felt like I needed that weren't necessarily on the list that's given to you by NCEES. And so I don't know how that's going to play out. So for me, I would prefer to do the paper-based version.
I think a lot of people are with you on that. I think, a lot of people, change is scary for anybody, right? We're all afraid to change in one way or the other.
Right.
Whether it's, I remember when I was in school and a professor or teacher would be like, hey, we're going to have an open book test today. Mm-hmm. People would get all excited. I'm like, what are you guys getting excited about it for? I said,
it's the worst thing ever.
You know what I mean? Yeah, it's going to make it harder because they're going to expect that you have you have the book to go through. And then also the drawback too is when you have an open book exam, I don't know if you just kind of are the way your mind works, where you think you need to get every single question right because you have essentially you have the answers in the book somewhere. So you're spending a lot of time on questions that you normally wouldn't have, and you might not even finish your exam. So, just because something's an open book exam doesn't mean it's going to be harder or easier than a closed book. I think the removal from being able to take references is going to be a challenge for a lot of people. Learning to navigate through the handbook is going to be an obstacle for people. But for those that took the FE once it was computer-based, at least you've had that experience with the whole handbook where you want to become familiar with the equations, formulas, and things like that nature.
Right.
But a lot of people have asked me, hey, what are they going to do about the codes and standards? So in my experience with these other exams is if there's a question that requires a specific code or standard, you'll have a PDF of that specific code or standard available to you during the exam. So I'm interested to see the transition from paper, pencil to computer-based. I think it's going to be an exciting change, but I imagine there's a lot of people kind of chewing on their fingernails right now, wondering what's going to happen or what the change is going to entail. So, James, we're getting near the end of the day today, or the podcast for today. I want to ask you one last, well, maybe not one last question, but another question.
Okay.
So can you kind of take us back to that first immediate reaction that you had as soon as you found out that you passed the PE?
I thanked God and got on my knees and prayed and said thank you. That was literally my reaction, and I just jumped up and down, and laid on. And then after I jumped up and down, I laid on the floor. That was my reaction.
That is a heck of a reaction. That is exactly what I would do if the Indians won the World Series.
Right. It's and for me it was different because I was scheduled to take the PE in April of 2020, but then the pandemic hit. So then I had to